Welcome back. You all were expecting Lester, and you're stuck with me instead. Um, for those of you online, I'm Parker Smith. I'm here for the next 15 months. So if you liked me, I said this on Sunday, but if you liked me last summer, you have a whole nother 15 months with me. And if you didn't like me last summer, then you only have to put up with me for 15 more months. And I'm looking forward to asking you questions and you answering, and then I'm just telling you all the reasons why your answers are wrong. Because that's what Bible study is about. But we're in the book of Joel, and I realized when I went back through everything we did last summer that we actually managed to do 12 lessons, which is kind of crazy because I was only here for like 3.5 months. But we went through 5 entire books of the Bible. And I don't know about you, but a lot of that information just kind of ran together for me over the last year. And so I went back and I reviewed everything that we did. And so I'm thinking that we can speed round some of this and review uh, what we've covered up until now in the minor prophets. Um, so just try to do this off the top of your head. Don't last summer I got a bad reputation for always making fun of the study Bibles, and I'm probably never going to live that down. But, these are the questions, just think back an entire year and just tell me what you remember. So the first, and we did this in no discernible order either, which is, uh, we started out with Haggai because I had to fill in twice, and there's 2 chapters in Haggai, and then we just kind of went from there in, again, no discernible order. So starting in Haggai, well, who was Haggai written to and when was it written? Does anyone remember anything at all about Haggai? Or an easier way to date it might actually to be if you remember what the message of Haggai was, because that might actually help you date it. Anyone? I know you're just dying to answer. Okay.
He was born during one of the 3 pilgrims' feasts, unleavened bread, Pentecostal, or wheat and tabernacles.
Yes, that is when we think, anyway, that he was born. But that doesn't help us date the book necessarily.
Yeah, he was born.
So the book we dated to 520 BC from August to December, and this was written to the Jews living in Jerusalem after they were allowed to return back from the exile. And then the message was, it was all about rebuilding the temple. So for a prophetic book, there was actually a lot of narrative within Haggai. So things I wrote down was, get to rebuilding the temple. God is with you. Everyone needs to be involved. And the new temple will exceed the glory of the former temple. So then what was our interpretation or our application of this message, right? What was our sort of takeaway from Haggai? Because we're not exactly called to go build a giant temple to the Lord and make animal sacrifices in 2023. But what are we supposed to do?
Spread the gospel.
Yes, but also,
Obedience.
yes, and the fancy word for that that we talked about on Sunday is sanctification, right? So we're not necessarily called to build a spiritual temple in order to rebuild a physical kingdom of God on earth, but we're called to make a temple out of our lives. And we do that through obedience to God. So, right, our application is, right, the temple of our lives is a spiritual objective accomplished by our cooperation with God's will. So that's the book of Haggai in a 5-minute nutshell. And then we went on to Obadiah. And Obadiah was the very short one, which is why it's very hard to remember what it's about. Does anyone remember anything about Obadiah at all? It's one of the depressing ones because it talks about kingdoms getting destroyed and people dying. Do we at least remember who was getting destroyed? It's the arch enemy of the Israelites. I'll give you a hint. It's like their arch enemy.
Assyria?
Well, it's Edom, right? So Assyria is Nahum, which is the next one. So that's a hint. I just gave you the answer for the next one. So you can say Assyria when I asked you for Nahum, and then you'll sound really smart. But so it's written 6th century BC. We dated it anywhere from 587 to 500 BC. Written to the kingdom of Judah, which we got into the sort of tribes and the genealogies, and we said, right, the kingdom of Judah was Judah, Benjamin, and some of the Levites. And then the message of Obadiah is the book condemns Edom and prophesies their destruction. Edom had cheered on and participated in the destruction of the kingdom of Judah, and there's a escalating condemnation. They watched Judah being destroyed. They rejoiced that it was being destroyed. They stole from Judah, and then they eventually killed people from Judah. God will punish the world for evil. And then we talked about it talked about sort of this idea of the united house of Jacob. It said the house of Jacob shall be a fire, and the house of Joseph shall be whatever. And so this is where we brought back the idea of the tribes in. And so this sort of gets into the our application of the message. Does anyone remember what we talked about? No.
What about my notes?
Right. So, right. We said the kingdom of Judah only was comprised of like 3 tribes, and not even the entirety of one of those tribes. But it keeps making reference to the sort of house of Jacob as as if that really still existed. And so we talked about right, true Israel is based off of faith, not on blood, and how this prophecy, found its ultimate fulfillment later. So our interpretation and application is pride is what caused Edom to fall. Sin begins with passivity. The day of the Lord is coming, and true Israel is based on faith, not on blood. Now then, we get to Nahum. Does anyone know who was the country being condemned in Nahum? Now, say it. Assyria, right? Specifically, what part of Assyria? Think Jonah. No, that's Genesis. Nineveh, yes. So we dated this to the 7th century BC, anywhere between 663 and 612. Once again, written to the kingdom of Judah. This was before their destruction and their exile. And the message was Judah at the time was a vassal state to Assyria, and Assyria's paganism had rubbed off on Judah. Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, would be destroyed. God is vengeance and wrath, but he is also slow to anger, Nahum says. There would be total destruction throughout Nineveh. Nineveh, at the time, it said, sells nations through her harlotries and sells families through her sorceries, but will eventually become essentially the laughingstock. And God said that he will show the nations Nineveh's wickedness. So, the main thing from that is that Assyria's wickedness was rubbing off on Judah, and God was going to smite Nineveh off the face of the earth, which he did. And then our interpretation of this and our application of this is that, right, it says God is wrath, but he's also slow to anger. So you cannot compartmentalize God's wrath from his mercy. This was written to the afflicted as an encouragement, even though there are really detailed and somewhat graphic scenes of the eventual destruction of Nineveh. This was all written as encouragement for the faithful in Judah who had suffered. And we also talked about how God takes very seriously causing his people to stumble. Right? We see Assyria causing Judah to stumble, and God takes it very seriously in that he destroys Nineveh from the face of the earth. Okay, we're getting there. We have two more books. Habakkuk. Does anyone remember anything about Habakkuk? See, this is like we're getting into like July at this point, so this is newer. You should remember this.
Well, it was written between 612 and 589 BC.
What are you using exactly? What?
Notes before the book in my Bible.
Well, yes, but who? What notes? Who wrote this?
I don't know. Just
Okay,
say,
so we dated it to 612 to 605, and that was actually the broader date. Um, so there were different times that it was dated to, and we dated it during the reign of Jehoiakim. Written to who? I'll give you a hint. It's the same answers like the last like 2 or 3 times.
Judah.
Written to Judah, right? So it was written to Judah, 612 to 605 during the reign of Jehoiakim. The message, right? We sort of made fun of Habakkuk because he was asking baby's first theological question. Why does God allow evil to go unpunished? It said that Judah has made the law of God powerless. And we talked about how this can only happen at an institutional level. And Habakkuk even calls out the government leaders at the time in the prince's court. There is coming a nation whose sense of judgment is just as corrupt, if not more corrupt, than Judah's. And so God says, essentially, I do not leave evil unpunished. I punish one wicked nation with another wicked nation, which then Habakkuk asks, well, how is that fair? And Habakkuk essentially realizes that this is just sort of the circle of life that God uses. And once Habakkuk sort of put in his place, he eventually pleads for a revival of his people, for God to essentially work like he did previously throughout Israel and Judah's history. And Habakkuk sort of ends it by deciding that he's going to rejoice in God no matter what may come, even the inevitable destruction of Judah. Our interpretation or our application of this is that, right, evil never goes unchecked. Just like Habakkuk, we often ask God, why do you allow, all the wickedness of this world to seemingly happen with no punishment? But, right, the answer is that that's never the case, right? You're either judged in this life or the next, and right today we don't exactly see God like smiting countries off the face of the earth. So it's often in the next life, but the point remains the same, right? God still does punish evil. We talked about how it was a top-down problem for Judah, right? The Jehoiakim was bad, and then his court was bad, and so that rubbed off on the common people of Judah. And right, we talked about making the law of God powerless, and how right we can do that too. We can, make the law of God ineffective. And ultimately, it talked about how God is going to use Babylon to punish Judah for the salvation of his people, it says. And so God works for the good of his people even when what he does isn't pleasant. And that's the same today, and that sentiment is echoed in the New Testament. Okay, finally, Zephaniah. Do we remember anything at all about Zephaniah? I'm hoping we can at least get like at least one book where we remember something.
It was written to Judah,
It was written to Judah.
640 to 621 BC.
Yes. So during Josiah's reign, and we dated it before 621 BC. Why? Do you remember? Just what happened in 621? What's the big thing Josiah is remembered for in Israel's history? his religious reforms, right, which started in 621. So if God's calling out all this wickedness, we said it was probably before the reforms, which would put it anywhere from 640 when he became king to 621 when the reforms started. And it was, right, we said written to Judah, describing their coming judgment by God. So once again, we have prophecy of Judah's judgment. And the message talked about the day of the Lord being a complete and total judgment for Judah at the hands of their enemies. Because of, Zephaniah specifically calls out the idolatry of Judah. Special judgment is reserved for the leaders of Judah. I actually think Zephaniah is the one where it talked about, he called out the king's court, but right, special judgment is reserved for the leaders who have sort of influenced the common people. And then, right, very big, important idea. God actually calls his people an undesirable nation. And then he calls the remnant of his people that still serve him my people, right? And so we get into the interpretation of this message, or the application, and it's that, the true people of God are those who follow him, right? The people in Judah that were living in idolatry, who were not following God, right? They had no claim to, call themselves, God's chosen people and the people of God, because the true people of God, as God Himself says, is the remnant who actually follows Him. And the rest of Judah who didn't follow Him, he uses literally the same word as he would use for any other foreign nation. So that was sort of the big takeaway from Zephaniah that we pulled out. And then finally we get to Joel after 18 minutes of background information. But I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't have done that, and maybe you didn't care anything at all about that. But I know when I was looking over Joel, I had forgotten almost everything that we had talked about last summer, because I've slept and taken tests since then. So, what do we know about Joel? This isn't even on the paper, but I'm gonna just hit you with a question. And this is the question you want to answer if you don't answer anything else. True or false? We have a pretty definitive date of Joel. You have like a 50-50 shot of getting this right.
I'm gonna say no.
No, we don't. Joel is actually, one commentary says, probably no other book of the Bible has a wider range of dates assigned to it than Joel. And this is very much true. And so I actually printed out a table, or a picture of a table, talking about some of the issues surrounding the dating of Joel. I'm not going to get into that, but I thought for your own edification, you can read that at your own leisure. And then next week I'll quiz you all about it, because I expect that you'll have read it by then. Right, but there's actually a lot of debate as to when Joel was written. And I most likely will actually be disagreeing with some of your study Bibles. So, but that's completely fine, because the message of Joel doesn't change a whole lot depending on when you date it. But, I never try to hide what I think. So I'm just going to tell you what I think. I think that this is pre-exilic. So this is written before the destruction of Judah and the exile of Judah. And scholarship is split half and half. Some people date it before the exile, some people date it after the exile. And then even within that, there's like a million different dates that people post for each side of that camp. So here's a couple things to think about. Judah never mentions Israel or Samaria. So we assume that Joel was active after the destruction of Samaria and after the fall of Israel, which happened in 722 BC. So we can probably safely say it's after the fall of the kingdom of Israel. There's mention of the temple still being active, and there's also no mention of a king of Judah. So it has been assumed that he was active after the exile, but also after the temple was rebuilt. So that's sort of, if you place it post-exilic, it would make a lot of sense for you to place it after the temple was rebuilt in 516 BC. But ultimately, a lot of these reasons are speculative. You can't really, and you see this chart that I printed out. For every reason to date it before the exile, there's a reason to date it after the exile. And if you notice, it actually says alleged implication, which means that, just because it says kings are not mentioned does not actually mean that there wasn't a king in Judah at the time. That just means maybe Joel didn't write it down for whatever reason. But if it dates pre-exilic, which is what, for the sake of the study, we're going with, then its message actually concerns a soon coming event. So there are a couple of options given: either the Assyrian siege of Jerusalem in 701, the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem in 597 or 598. And this was the beginning of the exile. This was sort of a smaller exile, and this is where the puppet king Zedekiah was instilled. Or this is talking about, and this is where we're going to go with for the sake of the study, this is written right before the eventual fall of Jerusalem in 587 BC. And why we're going with this is that it specifically mentions exiles, and the Syrian invasion was actually failed, so there weren't really any exiles there. And then the earlier Babylonian invasion did have exiles, but, and we're talking about this a little bit later, this is sort of set up to be the main event in Judah's history, which the main event in Judah's history was the Babylonian captivity. So we're standing on pretty solid evidence that this is probably what it's in reference to. So if it is pre-exilic, and if it is written directly before the 597, 598 siege of Jerusalem and the big exile, then, right, it would be written in either right before 597 or 598. So early, was that 6th century? Yeah. So, and that's my own position based on the research that I've done. And, this does slightly affect your interpretation of the passage, and we'll sort of get into that as we actually get into the book itself. But really, I mean, the application of the message is the same, and I mean, even the interpretation itself doesn't change a whole lot. So, you're not going to be, you're not going to be committing heresy if you date this after the exile. But so that's the issues of dating Joel, and there's a lot. So what do we know about Joel as a prophet? The man itself behind the prophecy. It's basically the same answer that we gave all summer long last year. We don't know very much about him. That's right. That's exactly right. And yeah, just like most of our minor prophets, we don't really know anything at all apart from what we see in the book itself. It says son of Pethuel. We don't know who that is. We don't know where he came from. We don't even know when he was born. That's why we can't take the book. So yeah, we don't really know anything about Joel. So that was sort of a trick question. But we're going to actually get into it now, and I broke this up, the first 12 verses and then 13 through 20. So we're going to read the first 12 verses and sort of dig into it. So Joel chapter 1, the word of the Lord that came to Joel, the son of Pethuel. Hear this, you elders, and give ear, all you inhabitants of the land. Has anything like this happened in your days, or even in the days of your fathers? Tell your children about it. Let your children tell their children, and their children another generation. What the chewing locust left, the swarming locust has eaten. What the swarming locust left, the crawling locust has eaten. What the crawling locust left, the consuming locust has eaten. Awake, you drunkards, and weep, and wail, all you drinkers of wine, because of the new wine, for it has been cut off from your mouth. For a nation has come up against my land, strong and without number. His teeth are the teeth of a lion, and he has the fangs of a fierce lion. He has laid waste my vine and ruined my fig tree. He has stripped it bare and thrown it away. Its branches are made white. Laments like a virgin girded with sackcloth for the husband of her youth. The grain offering and the drink offering have been cut off from the house of the Lord. The priests mourn who minister to the Lord. The field is wasted, the land mourns, for the grain is ruined, the new wine is dried up, the oil fails. Be ashamed, you farmers, wail, you vine dressers, for the wheat and the barley, because the harvest of the field has perished. The vine has dried up, and the fig tree has withered, the pomegranate tree, the palm tree also, and the apple tree. All the trees of the field are withered. Surely joy has withered away from the sons of men. Okay, so I'm trying to, I don't know what I did the rest of this, but okay, so let's get into this and let's talk about locust. I think that's actually what I have written down on your paper. It's just let's talk about locust. So simple question. That's actually not that simple because, like the dating of Joel, this is also very heavily disputed. Who or what are the locusts that Joel describes in verse 4? Or are they just locusts? What the chewing locust left, the swarming locust has eaten. What the swarming locust left, the crawling locust has eaten. And what the crawling locust left, the consuming locust has eaten. So, right.
There's some speculation that the locusts symbolize an invading army.
Right. So, there's some speculation, which should key you in. Right. This is very heavily disputed, just like the dating of Joel. So, right. Why do we think it would be an army rather than just a locust? Right. Chapter 1 anyway doesn't necessarily imply anything other than a locust invasion. Chewing locust, swarming locust, crawling locust, consuming locusts. Why are all these theologians with more time on their hand, say that this isn't actually locusts?
The word locust mean more than just grasshopper? Is it referred to maybe other types of insects?
Well, so the word itself, I mean, at a base level, yeah, I mean, it just means like locust grasshopper. I think the better question is, right, the way that the word locust is used in the Old Testament, does it always refer to locusts? Or no, you're shaking your head, right? That's exactly right, right? It's never always used exactly in reference to the insect. So here's just a couple arguments in favor of an invading army or locust being used like metaphorically as opposed to it literally just describing a locust place. So locusts were and still are very common in the Middle East. This is sort of set up as, hear this, you elders. Tell your children, let their children tell their children, and their children another generation, right? This is set up as something that has never happened before, that is so uncommon that you would tell generation after generation after generation. And locust plagues have always and still are incredibly common in the Middle East. Locust infestations are very brief, and the damage is hardly economically disastrous, right? In verses 11 and 12, right, the wheat and the barley has perished, the vine and fig tree is dried up, and all of this. And then later on, it actually talks about sort of or actually it's earlier, it's in like verse 9, talks about the priest not even being able to sort of do the sacrifices or the offerings because of the economic consequences of this locust plague, which we don't ever really see throughout the history of Middle Eastern locust plagues, which makes us think that maybe this is a little bit more serious than a normal locust plague. And then in Habakkuk, which we already went through, and verses 16 and 17, we find similar language to Joel's description of destruction. So let me, Habakkuk 3, 16 and 17. Well, verse 17 specifically, the fig tree doesn't blossom, the fruit doesn't have, there's no fruit on the vines, the labor of the olive fails, the fields yield no fruit, no food, the flocks are cut off. This sounds very similar to what Joel is describing, yet there isn't a debate in Habakkuk as to the fact that this is actually referring to an invading army. So it's very similar to what Habakkuk describes. And there's also, like we said, several other Old Testament verses which compare armies to locusts. And even other cultures of the time, like extra biblical sources, also compare locusts to invading armies. So, right, was this locusts? Was this an army? Was it both? Does it even matter? Maybe not. Right, but for the interpretation, it actually can have some pretty big consequences. So if this is an invading army, what is the invading army that it's being compared to? Well, no, because this is, well, think back to when we dated this. Think back to when we dated this, right? So, right, we said there was a lot of speculation, but for the purpose of our study, we were going to date this pre-exilic, right before what?
Babylon conquered them.
Yes, right before the Babylonian captivity, which means that the locusts, if interpreted metaphorically, would be Babylon, right? So, right, if you interpret this metaphorically, then the locusts are in reference to Babylon. And like we said, whether or not you interpret this metaphorically or literally can have some differences in interpretation. One of those is, is this a warning of the eventual exile of Judah and the biggest judgment of God that has yet to happen in Scripture, or is this a warning of a smaller judgment of God? One commentator writes, the emphasis on the uniqueness of this disaster suggests that this is a pre-exilic date, since thereafter the fall of Judah and the exile seem to dominate the prophetic writings as the disaster within Israel's history, right? So it says, like we said, tell your children and their children and their children and generations. Hear you elders. Has anything like this happened in your days? Right? If you interpret this literally as a locust plague, it kind of makes you wonder, why is this such a big deal? But if we interpret this metaphorically, then it makes a lot more sense given the shock value that Joel is sort of hyping up for his audience here, as sort of this is the event of judgment that you've never seen or heard of before. The same commentator also goes on to argue that the locust of chapter 1 and the locust of chapter 2 are not separate. It's not talking about different things. Some people have argued that the locust of chapter 1 are like literally locusts, and the locust of chapter 2 are an invading army. That's not really a super popular scholarly opinion, and there's a lot of reasons why it's not wise to break it up like that. The locust of verse 4 of chapter 1 and verse 25 of chapter 2 really need to be understood as these figurative symbols for the invading Babylonian armies. This was more than just one plague among many. This was more than just one more locust plague to go down in the history book. But this was the unstoppable invasion unleashed upon Judah that would consume it just as locusts consume a field, and nothing would be left. And this is sort of, once again, how, for the purpose of our study, how we're going to be interpreting Joel. So I hit you with another true or false question, right? So 50-50 shot. Verse 6 says, "For a nation has come up against my land, strong and without number. His teeth are the teeth of a lion, and he has the fangs of a fierce lion." So true or false? The my in verse 6 means God, or in other words, God is the speaker. And he's declaring Judah to be his land. What do we think? Bill looks like he's just dying to answer.
Who else's land would it be?
Well, so that's a good question. So, right, is this Joel saying, right, you know, a nation has come up against my homeland, and strong without number, teeth like lions. You know, the essential meaning of what's going to happen doesn't change, but there is sort of an interpretive difference between who you think is actually claiming possession of the land. Is it Joel specifically claiming possession of the land? Is Joel on behalf of Judah claiming possession of the land? Our land, the land of our home, as a nation is coming up against it. Or is it God saying, my land that I possess, a nation is coming up against it?
Mine's capitalized.
Yes, but
Make a difference.
you know, I wish for everything in the world that I would have actually looked at the Hebrew of this. I don't know what the actual Hebrew word is, so I cannot. I can neither can.
Saying my like the person. Would it just be
Well, like I said, I did not bother to look at the Hebrew of this, and I wish that I did. I can neither confirm nor deny that the original Hebrew, what the actual.
My version, it's not capitalized.
oh, it is
There you go. So yeah, so the original Hebrew is probably just. It's probably just the word land with the suffix my. So that probably doesn't necessarily from the text indicate that it's from God. So whatever translation you're using, the translators probably just interpreted that way and translated it with the capital M. That being said, that they're not necessarily wrong. It's just saying that that's an interpretation of the text.
Well, it can be God's land and Joel's land, both, can it?
this study Bible says.
I'm never going to live that down, am I? I'm never going to live down last summer
You're the one
Har-
that usually
har-
kept bringing it up.
harping on the study Bibles.
The possessive pronoun refers to the Lord. He is the owner of the land, the vine, and the fig tree.
Right. So I actually agree with John. That's the John MacArthur Bible. I said, yes, I actually agree with him for once. Yes, I think it's safest to assume that this is actually a direct quotation from God. You know, but keep in mind, just because the oracle is introduced as the word of the Lord that came to Joel, this does not necessarily mean that, like, God is the speaker all the time, right? And if you disagree with me about this, this is a different discussion, so just, you know. But just in the same way that a lot of people would say that, you know, the Bible being the word of God does not mean that God verbally dictated every single word of the Bible. In the same way that the fact that this prophecy is coming from God does not necessarily mean that God is verbally dictating every single word of the prophecy. However, there's a lot of reason to believe that this is actually a direct quotation from God, and there are some implications within this. The language that is being used is very similar to language in Ezekiel chapter 28, verse 16, when he says, "You will come up against my people Israel like a cloud to cover the land." And so we know that is talking, that God is talking and claiming possession over Israel, and the language is very similar. And so, right, if this is actually God, like a direct quotation from God, and not just Joel saying my land, or Joel on behalf of Judah claiming possession of land, what is this? Why does this actually matter? What is the interpretive difference, if there is any? Because think about, like, what is sort of the what is the prophecy about? Right? What is Joel actually prophesying here?
Well, Judah is going to be punished.
Judah's going to be punished, right? So if Joel's saying, you know, a nation has come up against my Joel's land, how would how does that make a difference between a nation has come up against my God's land, right?
Well, this refers you back to this verse in Leviticus 25:23, where it says, "The land is mine." It said, "God owns the earth and all that is in it." The people of Israel were in fact only tenants on the land by the Lord's grace. Therefore, ownership of property was temporary, not permanent.
Yes, but we're getting sidetracked though, because
So he referred to that land as his land.
yes,
He didn't consider it to be his.
if Babylon is going up against Judah, and the prophecy has already stated Judah is going to be destroyed. So if Babylon is now responsible for sacking Judah, right? What is Joel really saying here, right? If Joel is actually quoting God, Babylon's not just messing with Joel, and Babylon's not just messing with Judah, but Babylon's messing with God directly, right? This is the interpretive difference: is that God Himself is claiming, this is my land and this is my people, more so than you know, oh no, our homeland as Israelites is being destroyed, and we have to go do something about this. Not that they were able to do that anyway, but no, this is Babylon is actually fighting against God, right? And Babylon will not face human judgment, right? Babylon will face judgment from God. Chapter 3 mentions Tyre and Sidon, which are two places that benefited from the destruction of Jerusalem, and more on that when we get there. And God asks, "What have you to do with me? Will you retaliate against me? If you retaliate against me, swiftly and speedily, I will return your retaliation upon your own head." So God is essentially saying, you're not just messing with an earthly kingdom, but you're messing with, essentially my kingdom on earth. And if you mess with me, I'm going to retaliate against you. And you're not going to be just dealing with human punishment, you're going to be messing with heavenly punishment. Just as Judah's dealing with heavenly punishment now. In the same way that Judah's punishment is not merely just Babylon coming in and punishing Judah, because that's just, the hand that they were dealt, but God is actively directing the events. In the same way, when Babylon, gets their comeuppance, it's not going to just be one earthly kingdom striking them down, but it's going to be God Himself striking them down. And this is how it makes all the difference. Though God is judging Judah, He's also identifying His right to ownership over Judah and His right to vengeance once Judah is invaded and destroyed. And we're going to bring this back up in the application, because this is actually very good and very deep stuff that I think a lot of the times we don't necessarily think about.
So we can decide who that is talking.
God. Yes. It's God. Because if it's God, then like we said, Babylon is dealing with God and not just Judah. So verses 9 and 10. The grain offering and the drink offering have been cut off from the house of the Lord. The priests mourn who minister to the Lord. The field is wasted, the land mourns. For the grain is ruined, the new wine is dried up, and the oil fails. So verses 9 and 10 describe the house of the Lord. What is Joel stating here? Or in other words, what is the house of the Lord? And what are the practical and theological implications of these verses? So let's just start with the first one. In other words, what is the house of the Lord actually in reference to? Do what?
Tabernacle.
Well, we're past the tabernacle point, but you're basically there, because the tabernacle, right, was before they had the permanent temple, right? So, right, the house of God is in reference to the temple in Jerusalem, and because these locusts, or right, the Babylonians are cutting down all the fig trees and destroying all the grain. There's nothing left to make offerings with. So let's just start with sort of the practical implication of this. If you're a priest and you can't make an offering, even taking away all the spiritual, theological implications of what this means, what's sort of the practical consequence of not being able to make your daily offerings as a priest? Right? Just think about a priest who lives, you wake up and you're at the temple, and you go to sleep and you're at the temple, and you live, eat, drink, breathe temple. Right? What does this mean if all of a sudden the temple doesn't have any grain or any wine?
Can't perform their ceremony.
Well, right? Think very, very humanly, very, very practically, right? Your entire life is spent in a temple. You wake up in a temple, you go to bed in a temple, you hardly ever leave a temple. If the temple has no food and no wine, you don't either, right? And we know from Leviticus, Leviticus 2 verse 3, talking about after the offering is made, says the rest of the grain offering shall be Aaron's and his sons. And then in Leviticus 6:13, the fire shall always be burning on the altar. It shall never go out, before he immediately goes into the grain offerings. I actually just jumped ahead of myself there, but I was just mainly focusing on what I said for chapter 2, right? Once the offering is made, the rest of the grain goes to the priest. So if you're a priest and you're in the temple and there's no grain, there's no wine, right? The very practical implication of this is that, right, you're going to go hungry, you're going to starve. And then, right, thinking more biblically, right, you can't make your offerings to God. What is sort of the theological implication of this? Being cut off from God, right? Specifically, right? Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, that's actually it. Yeah, disobedience to God, being cut off to God through disobedience, right? A fire shall always be burning on the altar; it shall never go out, right? And all of a sudden, the fire goes out because you don't have anything else to make the altar, and the priests are unable to fulfill the requirements that God had established generations prior to there even being a temple, right? Just like we talked about before the temple, there was the tabernacle. So it was disobedience that caused the siege and the eventual destruction of Jerusalem, which now causes there to be nothing to make the sacrifices with. And then, funnily enough, this just causes even more disobedience because now the priests can't make their offerings to God anymore, which is in direct disobedience to God. So, right, whether or not the priests are technically like in sin or not, because different people classify sin in different ways. But that's a whole other discussion, right? It is clear that the priests are in disobedience to God, and that right there, the priests were always supposed to be making these sacrifices, and then now they can't. And so, right? The theological implication is that the priests are in direct disobedience to God. And so this is why in the next set of verses we see such a huge call for repentance, because this is a very serious matter of disobedience. What is clear is that the priests were not able to honor God in the way that he commanded, like we said, generations prior. So keep this in mind as we go into these next set of verses. It's focusing in on the priests, and then through the priests we get into sort of the common folk, the you and me of ancient Judah as it's being destroyed. That's a fun thought. So we're going to pick up in verse 13, and we're going to read through the rest of the chapter. Gird yourselves and lament, you priests. Wail, you who minister before the altar. Come, lie all night in sackcloth, you who minister to my God. For the grain offering and the drink offering are withheld from the house of your God. Consecrate a fast, call a sacred assembly. Gather the elders and all the inhabitants of the land into the house of the Lord your God, and cry out to the Lord. Alas for the day of the Lord is at hand. It shall come as destruction from the Almighty. It is not the food is not the food cut off before our eyes. Joy and gladness from the house of our God. The seed shrivels under the clods, storehouses are in shambles, barns are broken down, for the grain has withered. How the animals groan! The herds of cattle are restless because they have no pasture. Even the flocks of sheep suffer punishment. O Lord, to you I cry out, for fire has devoured the open pastures, and a flame has burned all the trees of the field. The beasts of the field also cry out to you, for the water brooks are dried up, and fire has devoured the open pastures. Okay, so I asked you what the significance of verse 14 mentioning all the inhabitants of the land are, right? So it's sort of, right, what we just read called out the priests. Lament, like a virgin girded with sackcloth, for the grain offering and the drink offering have been cut off from the house of the Lord. The priests mourn who minister to the Lord. And then we get sort of back to verse 13, and it's still talking about the priests. Gird yourself and lament, you priests. Wail, you who minister before the altar. Come lie all night in sackcloth. And then, after seemingly talking about the priests for several verses in a row, we get verse 14, which says, Consecrate a fast, call a sacred assembly, gather the elders and all the inhabitants of the land into the house of the Lord your God, and cry out to the Lord. So what is the significance of this? And why does it seemingly change focus from specifically the priest and those in the temple to all of Judah?
Well, they're kind of all in the same boat.
They were all in the same boat.
And none of them had anything to eat.
Right? Yeah, none of them had anything to eat. But, right, what was the purpose of the crying out to the Lord and the fasting? Was it merely to, get more food, or what was really the purpose of it?
Calling them to repent.
To repent, right?
For their sins.
So, you're right. They're all in the same boat, but it's not just that they're all in the same boat in the fact that they all don't have food, but they're all in the same boat in the fact that they're all responsible for the destruction of Jerusalem in their own way. Right? Verse 14 is still addressing the priests because they're the ones who are calling this fast and calling the sacred assembly and the elders and the inhabitants. But this forthcoming judgment is not reserved to the priests alone, but to the whole nation. Verse 2, right, it even mentions, give ear, all you inhabitants of the land. So this prophecy is directed towards everyone. And similarly, just as the judgment itself is not reserved to the priests, but to the entire nation, the blame is also put on the whole nation, not just on the priests.
Can I ask a question here?
You can't.
Would the priests be more responsible for their demise than ordinary people because maybe they're not performing their duties right? for the people?
Well, so I think a lot of that would just be, speculation, and I think there's several different reasons why. I mean, first of all, uh, if you're comparing, a priest who was evil and all he wanted to do was just rip people off and disobey God to, someone who actually was faithful to and followed God, but still obviously broke the covenant and disobeyed God, but was still what we would consider a good person, yeah, we would probably say that the priest was more responsible. But at the same time, there were obviously common people, who were more wicked than the priests. And at the same time, we're assuming that the right responsibility is sort of weighted in terms of, well, breaking the covenant in this way is worse than breaking the covenant in this way, and not, well, when I look down as God, when I look down, all I see is an entire nation that's breaking their covenant with me and is just falling into moral ruin. And I don't really know if we can say how God looked at Judah when he decided to, judge them. So I really don't know that we can say for sure without just getting into speculation. But from a human perspective, right, we talked about before in other books last summer this sort of top-down problem. And, right, you definitely have that, where the kings are corrupt and the priesthood is corrupt, and this sort of trickles down to the common people. But the blame itself is put on everyone. And we're never told that the priests fasted longer than the common people, or that the priests fasted in a different way than the common people, but they were all sort of in it together. They were all in the same boat, like you said. So,
So the priests really don't have control over the food or the wine, do they?
well, there is no food and no wine, so.
Well, I mean, they can't produce food. It's up to the people, the farmers, to produce the food. And
Right.
they can't.
Right, yeah.
I wouldn't see where he would hold of course, I guess he does hold the priest to a higher level of,
Well, the priest is supposed to be telling the people showing them how to live. I mean,
Yeah.
they're supposed to be setting examples, so to speak,
Yeah.
doing the right thing. But like I said, a lot of priests were evil and didn't do what they're supposed to. But I just wondered if that might have had a reason that they all got corrupt because the priests weren't doing what they were supposed to do in order to lead the people.
Yeah, I mean,
Like I said, speculation.
yeah, probably, but it's also very significant, like I said, that um, they're all called to do the same repentance. So, I mean, in God's eyes, um, they were all sort of equally as, morally corrupt. So,
God made it very easy to fast.
God made it very easy to fast. I feel,
Didn't have any food.
yeah, I knew there was a Bill joke coming somewhere, but yeah.
Well, one thing about it, they was going fast. They didn't have anything to eat.
Yeah, they were going to fast one way or the other. Yeah, they could either fast in repentance or fast while sinning. I missed you guys. I love y'all. Uh, and I think it's important to mention this. As much as we in our 21st century political climate don't necessarily like the idea of corporate guilt, this idea is actually pretty commonplace throughout the prophetic literature of the Old Testament. And also, this is not the people repenting for something that they weren't responsible for. But, right, every person in Judah, in some way or another, broke their end of the covenant with God. In the same way that every person who has ever lived has in some way or another sinned. So, every single person is told to fast and to cry out to God because all of the inhabitants are in some way responsible for what has happened to Judah. questions? We're good. Okay. In the same way that the destruction is like locust and it devours everything, right? The destruction is everywhere. The sin is everywhere. So, last question before we get into the application is, what/when is the day of the Lord in the immediate context of verse 15? So don't read ahead. Don't think ahead. Your study Bible is probably going to lead you astray, so I wouldn't trust it because it's probably going to try to read ahead. We're not asking for that. In the immediate context of verse 15, alas, for the day of the Lord is at hand; it shall come as destruction from the Almighty. What is this referring to?
An extraordinary happening.
Yes, and when we were dating, Joel, we said that the most extraordinary happening to ever happen to Israel was
The Babylonian exile.
the Babylonian exile, right? So yes, and this is not really that contested. So we're on pretty safe scholarly ground. Verse 15 in its immediate context is talking about the Babylonian exile. But it's important to note, Joel seems to include at least 3 different prophetic timelines throughout his book. There's the immediate context of the very soon coming Babylonian exile. And then chapter 2, it sort of picks up a New Testament timeline. And it gets into some, seeming to talk about the Holy Spirit. And then it also seems to talk about the end of times. Talks about like the moon turning to blood and all sorts of crazy stuff. So, and some scholars have tried to argue that Joel had multiple authors, and it was really more of like a conglomeration of several different prophets at the time. That's not really a fair assessment because the focus is always the same. And this is one of the things I really tried to drill in last summer, is even the times when prophecy, well, first I tried to drill in that most prophecy has a very immediate context. And then secondly, I tried to drill in that even when the prophecy seemingly has a far off context, the focus always remains very immediate and very localized to the people that the book was written to. And the case is the same for Joel, even in the areas where it seems to talk about God's Spirit being poured out on all people, which makes us think of Pentecost in the New Testament, or the moon turning to blood, or whatever, which makes us think of the end of times. The focus is always immediately on Judah, and so Joel, while changing, prophetic timelines, never really changes prophetic focus away from Judah at the time of writing. Now, as for verse 15 of chapter 1, like we said, the day of the Lord is simply that which he's already been describing for the entire chapter. The day of the Lord is this day which Joel asks, has anything like this happened in your days? The day where the chewing locust and the swarming locust and the crawling locust and the consuming locust devour everything. The day when this nation has come up against my land, strong and without number. This day where the vine has dried up and the fig tree has dried up and the apple tree and the peach tree and the grain and the priest can't make offerings. Everything that we've talked about up until now, Joel's not changing direction and saying, but alas for this day of the Lord. It's all part of the same prophecy. And Joel is saying, right, everything that I've talked about is God's doing, and it's the day of the Lord. And right, we sort of talked about last summer the day of the Lord because we ran into it twice, or actually 3 times. We ran into it in Obadiah, and we ran into it in, I guess just twice, Obadiah and Zephaniah. Obadiah, we talked about that it was very immediate and very localized. Obadiah called this the day of the Lord in reference specifically to God's wrath. Oh no, I'm sorry, I got it backwards. Obadiah, we talked about how it was both. It was both localized and immediate, and also far off, because God's wrath had been poured out against Edom, the day of the Lord, but Obadiah also mentioned God's wrath being poured out against all nations, which is yet to happen yet. So we talked about how this day of the Lord has not come in full yet. And then Zephaniah is the one that we said was specifically very localized and very immediate to the time of Zephaniah, because it was referring only to Judah's soon coming destruction and not some far off apocalyptic event. And that seems to be the case here within verse 15, taken alone without reading the rest of the book. Joel has in mind this soon coming destruction of Judah, which will destroy everything, affect the temple, affect everyone, and will be something so great and so never before seen that no one has seen anything like it, and for generations after, people are still going to be talking about it, which Jews today still talk about this, and this is still like one of the biggest events in their history. So, but right, remember, like we said, that the book will very soon, as we get into the next chapter, will seem to shift perspective away necessarily from Babylon into things that happen long after Babylon is gone. But remember, the idea of the day of the Lord in the Old Testament is never limited to a single event or a single day in history. It's really more of this motif, or this idea that God is intervening significantly in human history. And we've already seen that in the difference between how we interpreted the day of the Lord in Obadiah and the way we interpret it in Zephaniah, where one was both complete and incomplete, and one we said was completely fulfilled already. So keep this in mind specifically as we continue through the rest of the chapter, that the day of the Lord, God's judgment has been poured out and is also yet to be poured out. So now we get into everyone's favorite part, the application, because this is the part where there are seemingly no wrong answers. But what does Joel teach us about the nature of God's relationship to his covenant people, Judah? And look specifically at verse 6. So, for a nation has come up against my land, strong and without number. His teeth are the teeth of a lion, and he has the fangs of a fierce lion. So what does this teach us about God's relationship to his covenant people of Judah? We already really hit on this earlier, so you can just repeat what I said, and I won't even be mad. Right? What did we say were the implications of God specifically claiming ownership over Judah? Right? What were the implications of that for Babylon?
Well, Babylon was going to have to deal with God's punishment.
Babylon was dealing with God and not just with humans, right? So, like I said earlier, God is judging, even though God is judging Judah, he's identifying his right of ownership over Judah, and through that, his right to not only judge Judah, but also his right of vengeance to those he uses to judge Judah with, once it is eventually destroyed. And so, part of the covenant relationship is that God reserves the right to, and will not hesitate to, exercise his judgment over his people when they break the covenant. But also part of that is that he reserves the right to judge people who messes with his covenant people, right? All these nations that mess with Israel and Judah, they're never just messing with Israel and Judah, but they're messing with God. And today, we're not necessarily under the Old Testament covenant. We don't have this. How did I phrase it in here? Because I thought what I wrote was actually really good. something along the lines of we don't have this visible theocratic kingdom of God on earth anymore, right? America is not the new Israel, as much as some people would like to claim that it is. But we do not, go and fight battles to expand the kingdom of God. And when a nation invades us, they are not directly invading God's earthly kingdom. But, right, even though we're not necessarily the same as Judah, there's still this idea that when you mess with God's people, you're not just messing with God's people, but you're messing with God, right? When you cause a Christian to stumble and you cause a Christian to fall away, you're never just causing a Christian to fall away, but you're just casting inevitable judgment upon yourself by God. So this principle remains the same today. That God has this relationship with His people where He reserves the right to exercise judgment over His people when they break their end of the covenant, but He also reserves the right to vengeance over the people that judge and mess with His people. And so it's kind of two sides of the same coin, and that's very important. So the last question is, what does Joel teach us about human responsibility to God in a communal setting? So this is coming out of verse 14. Consecrate a fast, call a sacred assembly, gather the elders and all the inhabitants of the land into the house of the Lord your God, and cry out to the Lord. Right? So what does this teach us about human responsibility within a communal setting?
We are each one responsible for our own deeds and for our own repentance.
Exactly, right? But within that, our own being responsible, right, 10,000 individuals all being responsible adds up to an entire nation of wickedness, right? And that's exactly the point of Joel, and that's exactly the same today, right? Nothing has changed, right? Mentioned earlier that all of the inhabitants of Judah have in some way broken their end of the covenant with God and have brought the judgment upon Judah in a way already, even though at the time of writing it had not happened yet. Nobody that fasted was fasting on behalf of sins that they didn't commit. No one can claim that they're innocent and that they don't have part in the covenant being broken. Everyone in Judah had failed to live up to their end of the deal. And obviously some more than others, and we kind of talked about that. But there's still this idea of communal guilt, right? The sins of the individual adds up to the sins of the nation. And when we see, it's the same way today. When we see God's judgment being poured out, on a country or a town maybe, but really I think in terms of being poured out on a church, and I believe, witnessed this before, and it's never a good thing, but I think I have witnessed this before. Never point a finger and say, God is punishing His people, which in our times is the church. Never say God is punishing His people because the preacher is evil, or God is punishing the people because those wicked deacons. But we always need to point the finger at ourselves and say, what am I doing? And where is my own failure to live up to God's perfect standard, right? Because in some way we're all, just as we're all the people of God as a church and as believers, so too we're all responsible for failing to be the perfect people of God that we're called to be. So it's the same as it was in Joel. We all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So anyway, I know I've gone like 15 minutes over time and we haven't even prayed yet. So I apologize, but at the same time I apologize for nothing.